Okay, welcome back. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Central Asia as a potential adherent to the East Asian model. We'll look at roles of civic culture and civil society in political development in Central Asia. We'll look at the patronage networks, looking at the case of clans. Then we'll talk about democratization using the Kazakh case, and we'll look from a couple angles: the mechanistic angle, political party development, and then public opinion, which we will compare with Uzbekistan. So the East Asian model is the big question here. And the argument that many Central Asian leaders like to put out there is that we, like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan from the 1980s, we really need economic development first. And then when we're ready, we can have the luxury of democracy. And so remember, there were a series of consultative exercises that were carried out by the Central Asians in the early 1990s. And so these included things that distanced them from the communist past, that suggested that they were interested in democracy, at least to a certain degree, and maybe they'd go further. They formally distanced themselves from the old system by, for example, banning the Communist Party, creating their own parties. They had popular elections for the president, for parliament. They had constitution building exercises. Some of the constitutions were debated publicly. They were approved outside of the presidency. You had the extension of presidential mandates, maybe not by the constitutional process, but through referendums, so that it at least gave the people some sort of input into the process. And then, of course, you had constitutions and official constitutional amendments. Of course, there were major flaws in all these things. We've talked about the nomination procedures to get into the elections, gerrymandering, limited access to the media for those non-incumbents, those who weren't in office, and of course irregularities during the elections. The case that I love best, right before I made my way to Uzbekistan for the first time, the Turkmen had just had their elections, and their elections, which not coincidentally, I think it was 99% of the people showed up. But the way the elections were conducted is that state officials would walk to every apartment building, knock on every door, and say, "Have you voted? Show us evidence that you voted." And you're supposed to have a little ticket stub or something that you voted, or a stamp on your hand, whatever it is. And if you didn't have it, they would say, "Well, you've got until 4 p.m. to vote, because if you don't vote, that means no one lives here, and if no one lives here, we're cutting off the gas and the electricity." And so, of course, people went to vote. They didn't really have alternatives, and so they voted for Niyazov. So going back to the Central Asian model, these were countries where you had these non-democracies that were hurrying through economic reforms, purportedly aiming to ensure social stability, and then take on democracy a little bit later. So if you compare them with Central Asia with various Asian tigers, looking at the Asian tigers, you had economies that were growing fast, but democracies only in a very limited sense. You had opposition that was frequently treated unfairly. You had major limitations on freedom of speech and association, and only gradually did they increase these freedoms. But there are a few important points here. One, these elites wanted capitalism. Two, their bureaucracies were relatively uncorrupt. And three, they had institutions that would ensure policy implementation. So how does this differ with Central Asia? Well, the first aspect here is limited democracy. And so that's the one similarity. Central Asians and the East Asians from early on had limited democracy. But when you move into elite goals and elite preferences, the second element here, you find some changes. It's questionable whether these leaders in Central Asia really want capitalism, especially since power is fungible, right? That means economic power is translated into political power into economic power. The greater people control economic resources, the more they're going to strive for political power. In Uzbekistan, you had a relatively new underground opposition party from when I was there, so this was circa 2005, this newly developing opposition party, was really backed by wealthy business types. So this really highlights this. Oddly, it was called the Free Peasant Party. The point here being that uncontrolled capitalism can actually threaten these leaders. And we'll come back to that in a second. But elite preferences weren't necessarily for capitalism, much less democracy. A second point here is that the bureaucracies are highly corrupt and inefficient in Central Asia. They'll obey at the top and the bottom, but along the road there are lots of exceptions that are made really to the highest bidder. Like the Aral Sea, you can't see that the state blocks the flow of the water. It's like with a dam. The river flows that direction freely, but so much is taken out for irrigation along the way, people taking cuts, that it dries out before it actually makes it. So the Aral Sea is really a good metaphor for the bureaucracy in Central Asia. It's going that direction, but there's so many people taking cuts out that by the time it moves the direction that's been proclaimed, it might not actually make it that far. So the same could be the case with economic reforms if they were seriously pursued. But there's evidence that they're not being seriously pursued anyway. And another element here are institutions. Institutions only work so long as you've got lower levels within the institutions that allow them to work. And in fact, there's evidence that while Central Asian elites are ultimately in control, they maintain this control through a very difficult balancing act. They ensure loyalty by allowing representation of various clans and parceling out benefits to them. So paradoxically, leaders of these states are incredibly strong, but only insofar as they follow the unwritten rules of the game. And the institutions are really, and this is actually the case through much of the developing world, where institutions are political prizes, places where I can put my people to work, where they can get a regular paycheck from the state, and not necessarily things that are designed to ensure policy goes through. And I remember all the competing interests, the other types of elites we talked, the religious elites, the black market elites, the Russian elites. These all serve as constraints on rule. And they push Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan towards the status quo and away from democratization. And this is Central Asia's uphill battle. In many ways, democratization stalled quickly in Central Asia because there was no will from the top. But there were other structural reasons that democracy faced this uphill battle. And these allowed the elites to say that they weren't ready for democracy quite yet. Among these include a lack of experience or a lack of a historical model. So putting democracy in our own unique geopolitical, cultural situation is going to be different than just importing Western modes of democracy, or even Eastern modes of democracy, such as the Japanese model of democracy, or the East Asian Tiger model of democracy. Of course, that's what they claim to aspire to. But that's not what they're moving towards. There's also the element of this ill-defined national interest on a macro level, where social interests, and social interests on a micro level too. Who are we and what is good for us? Right? This goes back to the first day of class. What is our identity? Are we estranged cousins of the Russians? Are we long-lost Asians? Are we Western hopefuls? Who belongs in our society, and what should be there in our place? So you've got a lack of defined social interests as well. What's good for us? Right? Do we want a strong leader? Do we want? This even comes down to the notion of political versus economic rights. People who groups and societies that tend to focus on economic rights tend to look more at the community, the communal level. Those that focus on political rights tend to look more at the individual level. More on this in the Politics of Human Rights class, which you're more than welcome to take, invited to take. Next, we've got economic weakness, even economic decline. And in fact, you've got economic decline in all of the states of Central Asia throughout the early period. When you're teetering on the edge of the cliff, even the wolves' teeth on your hands might feel nice, right? They're pulling you back up. So the wolves, of course, being the Central Asian leaders, the dictators, in a sense. Then you've got a lack of a mature civil society, or at least one that's that's independent of authorities. So civil society tends to be weak. And there are these things that we call gongos, government organized non-governmental organizations that are the only ones that can get money, except for Western-backed organizations. And there's a whole big problem with those as well, because they tend to adopt agendas that are more suited or more in the interests of the West than their own populations. In other words, they adapt in order to gain grants, and the grants that they gain might be for goals that their own people aren't particularly interested in. Finally, we've got this element that there's no civic culture, a democratically oriented political culture, because the culture that you find tends to be deference to authority figures and feelings of hopelessness in the political sphere. And we'll focus on the last two, which are interrelated a bit later. So I'll stop here.